Hi, I'm Gretchen McCulloch, and I'm an internet linguist. I'm the author of Because Internet, a book about internet language, and I co-host Lingthusiasm, a podcast that's enthusiastic about linguistics. I'm here to talk about how linguistics can help you learn a language. First, what is language? We often think of language in terms of this dichotomy between written and spoken. The written side is formal, and the spoken side is informal. But this conflates two separate things. Is all speech really informal? I don't go home and talk to my dog like I'm giving a presentation. For one thing, dogs don't really have much appreciation for a finely crafted PowerPoint. And for another thing, I don't have a dog. But is all writing really formal? What if we split up these two properties, formality and format? What else could we put in the extra two spaces? For one thing, we'd have a spot for formal speech, like the kind I'm doing right now, you see on radio, TV, media, actors. And then we'd also have a spot for informal writing. That could be things like chat, texting, language people put on social media. Informal writing is things like key smash, things like you can't pronounce it. Well, okay, I just did, because apparently this is people's favorite part of the Because Internet audiobook, and I really wanted to give the people what they love. But the whole point is that it's written. And yet, surely it's not formal key smash. Formal styles of language are the kind that you learn in school. And this is just as true if you're learning a first language in school as a second or third language. You go to school to learn Shakespeare or essays, not to learn how to text your friends again. But the problem is, then you step out into the world and you're trying to interact with actual people outside a language class, if it's not the language in the rest of your community. And you're like, oh no, this is not what I prepared for. I've tried to learn languages in both apps and classrooms, and I've run into this same problem. I'm a linguist, and it was this puzzle, this gap between what I was putting down on the page in the classroom and what was, or more likely wasn't, coming out of my mouth when I was trying to carry on an actual normal conversation that made me want to find out more about how language works in general. I remember reading the front pages of my French-English dictionary when I was about 12, because first of all, we still had paper dictionaries back then, and second of all, I was extremely that kind of nerd. And having my mind blown that thou wasn't just a generic, oldie-timey word, it was actually singular and informal, like French tu. And you was originally just plural, and then plural and formal, and gradually just sort of took over everything. And I thought, okay, what else could I learn about my own language and other languages if I approached language like a linguist? Looking at language like a linguist often means looking at these informal areas, the parts that really tap into the subconscious aspects of language. So let's start with informal speech. The first thing to know about informal speech, and informal signing for that matter, is that it happens with our human bodies. When we produce sounds, we're basically manipulating a living meat clarinet. There is a mental image. And there are certain ways of moving our bodies, our lips, our tongues, our jaws, that are easier and more efficient than others. So if we think about a question like, why do C and G make so many different sounds in various languages? Why do we have a hard C and a soft C? We don't have hard P or soft W. So why these letters? In Latin, these two letters stood for only the k and g sounds. Sounds that are produced by pressing the back of your tongue up against the back of the roof of your mouth, just before it becomes your soft palate. You can try it. K, g. But if you think about the difference between how you say these two words, the k sound in these two words, ki, ku, with ki, your tongue is hitting the roof of your mouth a little bit further forward on your hard palate. And with ku, your tongue is hitting a little bit further back. And that's because of the vowels. E is more towards the middle of your mouth, and oo is further back. It's a little bit easier, a little bit more efficient to have your tongue already in position to say the vowel. When you multiply this tiny bit of efficiency across hundreds of years, generations of speakers, you get the k and g sounds diverging from themselves depending on which vowel comes next. So e and a, pushing them a bit towards the front of the mouth, especially in the descendant languages of Latin. So you have French merci and Italian città and Spanish gente and Portuguese imaginar, and all of those are pushing the sound somewhere slightly different, but closer to the front of the mouth. This is a thing called palatalization. You're pushing certain sounds more towards the middle of your hard palate, where you make the e and the y sound. And you actually get the same thing with more sounds, with t and d, s and z. They can also get pulled towards the palate and made into sh and zh and ch and zh sounds. So English does this in words like nation or combinations like didje. Portuguese does this in words like universidade. Gaelic does this. Actually, all the Celtic languages do this. Russian does this. Tons of languages do it, and I'm not doing justice to any of them. But it's a really big phenomenon that happens all over the place. And then you get languages doing all sorts of shenanigans with spelling to make up for the fact that actually, whoops, sometimes you don't want to palatalize, and you do want to have a g or a ki sound. So now you've got to add an h or an extra silent vowel like u, or change the c to a q, or just somehow figure out a way to spell huge, which nobody really knows. And then what's even more fun is you get a language like English, which borrows in various words that are using different spelling conventions for whether you do or don't do something. Sometimes a sequence of GI is hard, as in give. Sometimes it's soft, as in ginger. And then you make up a new word based on an acronym. People end up all over the place when it comes to how to pronounce it. I'm not even going to say this word out loud. Don't at me. The second thing to know about informal speaking is that it happens between humans. Humans who create a conversation in real time by going back and forth with each other. Broadly speaking, there are two main styles of how we take turns in conversation, which are called high involvement and high considerateness. This is from the work of the linguist Deborah Tannen. High involvement versus high considerateness can show up between languages. So Italian speakers tend to be more high involvement, Finnish speakers or Japanese speakers tend to be more high considerateness, and even between regions of the same language. So within English, New Yorkers tend to be more high involvement, and Californians tend to be more high considerateness. High involvement conversation is like playing a game where you're trying to keep a balloon in the air. Each person's trying to gently tap the balloon as it begins to fall, long before it actually stops moving or hits the ground. The way you show you're engaged and interested in a high involvement conversation is by jumping right in, even overlapping by a few syllables, to show that you're paying close attention. High considerateness conversation is like playing a game of catch. You toss a ball from one person to another, each person catches it, holds on to it, and then passes it on distinctly to another player. The way you show you're engaged in a high considerateness conversation is by giving each statement room to breathe, pausing and allowing a beat of silence before taking your own turn. Like all good dichotomies, high involvement versus high considerateness is actually a continuum. Unless you're really far at one end, you've probably met people who are more talkative than you, who don't let you get a word in edgewise, and also people who are less talkative, who make you feel like you're holding up the conversation all by yourself. And both cases can be tricky. So counterintuitively, Tannen's research suggests that the way to make things less awkward when you're talking with someone when your conversational style doesn't match is to do the thing that feels rude. So that means to interrupt, or to do what feels like interrupting, if someone isn't letting you get a word in edgewise, and to leave an awkward silence, or a silence that feels to you like it's awkward, if someone isn't saying anything. I'm going to say, picking just a handful of interesting things from linguistics was a real challenge for me, so I tried to pick a few things from Lingthusiasm that our listeners have responded to really strongly. There's also way more where this came from if you're interested. And it's not quite related, But Lingthusiasm listeners really liked this fact about the French accent circonflexe and how it indicates an S that was there historically but got lost. So pâté and paste are actually from the same root. So I just feel like I need to make sure that any French learners know about this one. Let's put speech down aside for a second and think about the other side of informal language, informal writing. So informal writing is often internet language, which, spoiler, I like so much that I wrote a whole book about it. But you can also find historical precedents like postcards and diaries. Sometimes informal writing is trying to represent informal speech more accurately. So in French, people often say or say instead of tu sais and je sais, and so you see that showing up on social media as well. Sometimes it's just trying to make things faster to write by abbreviating them. One of my favorite things you can do with informal writing is trying to represent not just what you're saying, but how you're saying it. There are tons of examples of this, but here are two of my favorites from Because Internet. One is repeating letters. So that's when you write a word like hey with lots of Y's to indicate that you want to say this sound for a longer period of time. And this is especially common in languages that use the Latin alphabet or that use alphabetic writing systems in general, where you repeat a letter of the alphabet. In languages that don't use the Latin alphabet, they often use a different symbol, and that's the tilde, this sort of wavy symbol, to indicate the same thing, the lengthened sound. So writing something like hey with tildes can indicate, okay, here's a way that I'm elongating this, but I'm not repeating letters of the alphabet. And this is carried over into some languages like Singlish and Tagalog that are influenced by Chinese and Japanese and Korean cultural exports, even though they still use the Latin alphabet. One of my favorite ways of conveying how you're saying something or how you're reacting to something online is by using various forms of digital laughter. And these are often sort of language or orthography specific. So you see a lot that are based on letter H, letter K, because ka, ha sound fairly similar. And then you see some fun ones like in Thai, where they use the number 5, 5, because the word for 5 is ha. So this makes sense immediately. And then in Japanese, they often use this www, which does not refer to a URL, but it's from warai, meaning laugh or smile. So that indicates laughter, and then there's a whole bunch of extended further things you can do with that. Informal writing involves so many facets of the same desire to be flexible with language, to make what you write correspond more closely to what's in your head and what's in your community, rather than to what's in a style book or a dictionary or an external authority. So if we return to our question from the beginning, what is language? I decided to try to answer this in true internet fashion. Yes, I consulted the oracle of the human id, stock photo sites. And what the stock photo sites say language is books. Okay, a couple blackboards, whiteboards, glasses that you read books with, but mostly books. The idea of language as a book, or as a sufficiently large quantity of books, isn't a fact, it's a metaphor. And it only dates back a few hundred years, back when big comprehensive dictionary projects started getting going. So Samuel Johnson's dictionary was in 1755, there were others in other languages around this period. And metaphors change. I mean, this was a generation of people who were also using steam engines as metaphors for the brain. Metaphors really need to change sometimes. Perhaps the biggest influence that the internet can have on language isn't just some fun words you can text to somebody. Like, that's great. But the internet can also be a new metaphor. Language is like the internet. It's a network, a web, an open source project, a participatory democracy. Language is a network, and what that means is that it can have the characteristics of a network. So if someone writes in the margins of a book, that's vandalism, that's anti-authoritarian. But when you add more sites to the internet, more links between sites, when you meet new people, when you say a sentence no one's ever said before, make up a new word, that makes the network better, deeper, richer. When you leave a book on a table, you expect it to look the same the next day. But when you leave the internet overnight, you don't expect to wake up to find that everyone stopped talking without you. Language keeps changing because it lives in the minds of living human beings. If language had to be transmitted the exact same way from one generation to the next, it would be brittle and fragile. It could be lost, the way a manuscript can be lost. But we've never met a society without language. If you throw a bunch of kids together, they'll reinvent language, even when the adults aren't giving it to them. And that's because we recreate language in our minds every generation. So when we think about what is language, what does it mean to learn a language, it's useful to step outside of this book metaphor and also think about what else can we get when we interact with people who are using language. When we think about the subconscious things we're doing using language. We think about the fact that we're all in a body and in a society that's using language. That's why I'm so into linguistics. Thanks for coming along to talk about linguistics. If you're looking for more internet linguistics, my book is Because Internet. If you're looking for more linguistics of all kinds, my podcast is Lingthusiasm. If you're looking for me in general, I tweet at Gretchen McC, and my website is GretchenMcCulloch.com. Enjoy the rest of your Duocon!